So when I sat down to have lunch here, I was telling someone how I got into agriculture, and it was basically during the 1980 debt crisis when a group of people from the International Ag Trade Research Consortium came and tried to convince the world's bankers that agriculture was important to them. And the bankers didn't really care, so they sent me to find out what these guys wanted, and Sherman was one of those folks. And I remember sitting and listening to the presentation of all the modeling and thought, wow, this is a really fascinating sector, and I don't ever want to be a modeler. So I had a bit of time to look at the report that Mark presented this morning on my flight back from Dubai, which is really super OPEC already, and did not get to see Sherman's report, so I'll kind of be looking at that a bit on the fly. First of all, these are really, both of them, terrific studies. I think they lay out a set of issues that we have all been sort of addressing in theory and in a very conceptual level, but it's really important that we're starting to get down to the level of modeling these kinds of scenarios where we're integrating what's going on in the economic sector and what's going on in the sort of physical climate sector. Over the past couple of months, I've been to several meetings where the sort of the policy makers have been trying to integrate these ideas. One was a meeting in The Hague a couple of months ago on ag, food security, and climate change, where about 50 agricultural ministers from all over the world came to hear similar kinds of reports. And really, I think for many of them, it was the first time that they began to grapple with just how big a challenge we have, and of why what is going on in Cancun this week is going to be really important to their portfolios, which in many countries are not dealt with by the Ministry of Agriculture. The other meeting was the one I just came from yesterday, which was the World Economic Forum's global councils. And I think what was, where I'm sitting on the council on food security, and what I think was interesting in particular about this meeting at the World Economic Forum was the fact that according to others who've been there before, for the first time, food security was the hottest topic at this meeting. And this is the group that leads into the big Davos jamboree in January. Basically, the people who deal with water issues wanted to come talk to the agriculture, food security folks. The innovation people, we had a packed room of the people who were dealing with all sorts of technology that came in to talk to the food security team, and also, of course, the climate change folks. And I think, again, this is an indication that the policy makers and the business leaders, maybe even more importantly, are starting to really recognize that climate change represents a risk for them. I had a long conversation with one of my former bosses, who was a CEO of a major grain company, who said that they are starting to look 30 to 50 years out as they're making their investments, and they're looking at climate change risks. They are also looking at where there might be endangered species, so that they don't end up finding out after they've sunk $100 million into a sugar processing plant that they put it in the middle of some place that might be of concern from an ecological point of view. So a real sea change, I think, in how the business community and the policy makers are beginning to look at this sort of nexus of issues. So I wanted to make a couple of specific points on the report that Mark presented, and then, of course, ask a lot of questions, which is what a discussant is supposed to do. So I think the one point in the paper that Mark presented is that the price increases he looks at and they project are assumed to be pretty gradual price increases. And Sherman talked about sort of shocking the various models and I think one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years, when we had the price increases in '07 and '08 and the recent Russian harvest problems, is that it's the variability of prices. So even if the prices are going up over the long term, might create difficulties, but this variability that we are experiencing even now is a real challenge. And I think that point maybe could be more brought out in the report, that you all are, by the nature of this scenarios, projecting something that's gradual, but the discontinuity may be a real problem. The other thing that struck me when I was reading this, and Mark really pointed it out, if the best case scenario is that we, on nutrition, is that we still end up with 85% of the calorie consumption in the poor countries that we have now in the rich countries, under the best case scenario, that's still not very good. And if we're looking at some of the worst case scenarios he presented, then it really has to make you wonder that the amount of resources that we in the U.S. government and the international community are planning to put towards the issue of resolving poverty and malnutrition are really a drop in the bucket if we're trying to sort of overcome the impacts of climate change on top of just dealing with the current problem that's already far too bad. The other thing I think that struck me a lot in the paper that Mark and his colleagues prepared was the trade numbers. I think the narrative generally in the U.S. farm community is that climate change is not going to be terribly negative for the United States, because many of the projections show that we're going to be able to increase yields in a lot of crops. But to my knowledge, no one has really put forward the notion that we may see exports decline in the U.S. as a result of climate change because of the kind of both economic and physical constraints that Mark presented. And I think this will be really news to a lot of U.S. agribusinesses and U.S. commodity groups, and will affect not only maybe how they're thinking about climate change, but certainly affect some of the investments that they may be asking for the research community to make in terms of helping overcome some of the climate change issues in the rest of the world. The other thing that struck me about what Mark presented was, the case of the perfect mitigation scenario, or the no climate change scenario, certainly sort of gives you the counterfactual of what the world would be like if we didn't have climate change. And I think, again, a lot of people sort of assume, well, we can't really do anything about climate change because it's already been set in motion. So we're sort of kind of giving up. And if we talk about mitigation at all, it's in terms of, can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by farmers so that they can get another source of revenue by being paid by some market force to make those reductions in greenhouse gases. But this really brings home the point that we still need to start now in a serious way talking about mitigation, not just as an income strategy for farmers, but also to deal with the bigger challenges that are projected after 2050. So as detailed as these scenarios are, they still raised a number of questions in my mind about information that I would, as a policymaker, would perhaps want. One in the Mark's paper is, it wasn't clear to me what assumption was being made about the subsidy regimes behind the models. And whether or not the U.S. and Europe continue with the particular subsidy regimes we have, but you look at a lot of developing countries who are subsidizing the use of fertilizers, who subsidize the use of water. How those are seen to be evolving will have a tremendous effect on how countries adapt or not to climate change. So having a little clarity on those assumptions would be, I think, really useful. The other question, as someone who is in a position right now of trying to figure out where to invest research dollars that we hope are coming to us from the Feed the Future initiative, it would be interesting to get a better handle on what kind of research investment do we think is needed to achieve that 40% yield increase that Mark mentioned? And what's the balance of where we should be putting our money? How much of that should go into genetics or sort of basic research, and how much of it should go into improved management practices, and how much into extension work? And I think may not have to have a hard answer to that, but I think that's kind of the next layer of questions that those of us who are hoping to direct some of those dollars would want to know. The other sort of question this raises is, if I remember correctly, the analysis shows that there is a much greater benefit to irrigation in Asia than there is to irrigation in Africa. And one of the key parts of many countries' strategies in Africa is actually to increase their irrigation. And I guess it would be useful to have a sense of whether that's a good strategy or not, or whether they should be more focused on other kinds of management techniques, and we should be putting the investment in improved irrigation more in the Asia region. So the many things that I thought, wow, it would be really interesting to have a little more information on. One is the impact of climate change on nutritional value. There's a lot of research that's been done at the Ag Research Service showing the impact of weather on starch and sugars and crops, the impact of weather on micronutrients, and it's clear that climate change is going to have a big impact on those variables as well. And I'm not saying this is something you all should have been able to do in your study, but I think that's another next layer peeling of the onion. One of the things we talked about at the World Economic Forum, and I think it pertains here too, is I think we need a little more granularity on what demand is going to look like in different parts of the world. I mean, we know sort of the narrative of we're going to be increasing meat consumption and fruit and vegetable consumption, but getting down to sort of one layer below that of what kind of meats, what kind of vegetables, how is that demand really going to evolve in individual countries, because it helps us as we're trying to address the productivity and the production issues. The other issue that was not addressed that I think is going to be important as we're looking at climate change is the impact on post-harvest loss, where if you have higher heat, higher moisture levels in certain countries, there's going to be much more stress on post-harvest loss. Also, climate change and weather can have a big impact on the resiliency of the crop to be able to withstand those kinds of post-harvest loss stresses. So again, this is another issue where we can focus some of our efforts in adapting to climate change, but it's not one that's usually addressed. And along with that, an issue that's, I think, not well understood yet is what is this going to do to the pest and pathogens, microbes in the soil. These are all things that when you get to specific locations and localities, it's going to have a huge impact on how different crops and different farmers can adapt and adjust. And again, not a lot of research and understanding on that yet. When I was talking to one of our scientists at ARS this morning about some of the work that they've been doing, he basically pointed out that the climate change models have made huge strides forward in the last few years, and as have the economic modeling made huge strides forward. But the crop models, he described them as your father's Oldsmobile. And he basically said that we're trying to understand better all of the complexities of what happens to various crops in various locations, but we don't really have a very good handle on that. So as even using kind of the best crop models that are out there, we still can't look down and say, well, what does this really mean if we use this variety of rice in this particular region? What impact is that going to have if we have a temperature variation? The other issue that he pointed out to me was the cross-cutting impacts of ozone, which is not something that's usually considered, and I don't think it was considered in the current modeling scenario, that basically we're already losing, according to the scientists, about 10% of our soy production in the United States every year as a result of ozone, year on year. So, you know, a lot of times we look at CO2 and it's going to, in many cases, increase productivity, but we don't incorporate into some of these models the negative impact that we're seeing on ozone. So I just want to come to one other point on the trade piece. And while I was at the World Economic Forum, they passed out a document called Trade and Climate Change. I don't think the word agriculture was even mentioned in that document. So that's striking in and of itself. And Sherman's work certainly highlights sort of the toxic mix of climate change and protectionism on prices, but I think the topic of the conversations in the World Economic Forum were actually the reverse. It's, you know, what is the impact of trade restrictions on climate change, and, you know, where trade policies may lead people, trade and subsidies may lead people to produce products that might not be the best suited for the particular climate or the environment, and may actually exacerbate climate change over the long run. So with that, I will stop, but I think these are both really great reports and will contribute a lot to the policy debate. Thanks.